Hi folks, Professor Wilkinson here for MCOM 6364. I just wanted to make this video for y'all to be able to watch on your free time outside of class, sort of as a makeup for the cancellation that we had the week before spring break. Hope everybody had a relaxing spring break, but also a semi-productive one. And what I would like to do is just cover basically the readings from the two textbooks, and then the last few slides I have posted are basically questions from the three supplementary readings, G, H, and I, that were assigned for that day that class got canceled. And I would like you to read the questions, answer the prompts for those three, and then we will start class on the 27th with a discussion of those. So we'll try to be efficient by focusing on those questions, and then we will from there be moving on to focus groups. So please do recall that I've assigned homework. I did that basically on the day that the campus shut down. You're to be conducting 2 interviews as well as a reflection post, and putting those in your private discussion forum by Sunday, March 30th. There are instructions in the assignment section. These are 2 questions at the end of chapter 3, questions 1 and 2 of the Brennen textbook, basically asking you to interview somebody that you do know and somebody that you don't know, and think about, reflect on the differences in those. Also, do keep in mind that you should be applying the principles and some of the basic techniques that are discussed in the readings, particularly that chapter of the Brennen book, and also Lindlof and Taylor sections that focus on interviewing. So, I have these slides posted, and what I encourage you to do is have the PowerPoint open, and I'll be referring to particular slides, and I think it's easier to follow with 2 windows open by you, this video and the PowerPoint, rather than trying to embed it. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So as I said, I'll be covering the textbook readings, but not the supplementary readings. We will discuss those at the beginning of class on Thursday the 27th, so please do be prepared to talk about those. Okay, so the first couple of slides that I put together for interviewing deal with, or a summary of, Professor McLaughlin's visit to class. So I have listed on the first slide the source, that is the publication that he and I were talking about. The key theme being that in terms of deliberating alone, people have a reasonable, want to have a reasonable conversation about politics, but they often decide that productive conversations are not possible because other people are uninformed, irrational, closed-minded, and uncivil. Unfortunately, that's a reflection of the context that we've been in for quite a while, with the sort of deepening partisanship in not only our politics but also in our social lives. And as we talked about in class, a lot of the discussion was around immigration, certainly a topic that is very much with us again, with issues surrounding deportations recently in the night by the Trump administration, and the legal battle back and forth with district court, etc. So what we were trying to do, and what we try to do in interviews generally, is get to know people and their story. And as is talked about in both textbook readings, that's really important to establish rapport and get people comfortable to share their stories with you. It's also really important, and this is emphasized in both of the readings as well, to be a good listener and to be looking out for unexpected material, and then comments, points of view, whatever it might be, and be ready to respond to them. Sometimes having to reword a question or change the question order that you had gone in anticipating in order to do that. Be ready to ask the same question in different ways, because sometimes people don't quite get it. the way that you've phrased it, and you have to be a little bit creative in terms of coming at it from a different point of view. If they write out, state, I don't get it, I don't know what you're asking, or if their response suggests that they haven't really understood the question the way you intended. Update the interview protocol along the way. You need to be flexible in terms of doing that, and in that sense, it's really important to know that protocol in terms of what's coming, to be able to pop a question in earlier, or maybe be able to go back to one that you skipped over in order not to move too far away from a line of discussion that you developed with the interviewee. Try to make the interviewees comfortable sharing their opinion without sharing your own. Sometimes that's hard. As academics, we're asked to give our own opinions, and we need to really be listeners in this sense, and maybe help, frame or guide, but not to sort of determine what we should be talking about, or, imposing one's own views or preferences on the interviewee. So, excuse me, I need to advance here. Don't feel pressure to get everything you anticipate from one interviewee. Keep in mind that you're going to have multiple interviewees, and not everybody is going to be able to or comfortable to talk about every topic that you want to cover. So if some are lighter, have confidence in the fact that you're likely to get that information from somewhere else, or maybe just leave it and then circle back to it at the very end. You should have some way of noting what questions you need to go back to in that sort of critical closing segment of the interview. It's important to establish rapport, as I said, but you don't want to go too far in making it too informal. I've seen this happen sometimes where the depth or the direction of the interview gets affected by sort of just being a little bit too comfortable and a little bit too close with the interviewee. So you need to sort of strike that balance. In the analysis phase, don't try to capture everything. Focus on the salient points or themes. Look for those nuances. So we're going to talk about that a bit more when we talk about analyzing data, but you should be thinking about the overall, themes that are emerging, and sort of what particular interviewees are contributing along the way. And in that sense, it's important to keep field notes about interviews that you conduct. If you're in a situation where you're trying to conduct as many interviews as quickly as you can, like an intercept type scenario, like we often do, in West Texas at like the Jamaica's, the church fairs, for example, still take a minute or two to make some notes before you move on to the next one. It's important, just impressions, anything that stood out, what sort of the general interest or character of the interviewee was like. Interviewing can be a messy, idiosyncratic process, as communication is generally. We all know that, and we should only make assumptions that we can support. That is, be careful about going into the field with too many expectations about what you're going to find, because those, if they're not met, can lead you to trying to get information that isn't really coming from the interviewee, but rather that you're trying to extract from them in order to fit that assumption and make those assertions in your final write-up. When working with teams, regular conversations among the research group members is important. We talked about that, in the work that we did with Dr. McLaughlin, and if we were each working independently, it would have been really hard later to sort of coalesce the data that we found, and along the way, the sorts of questions we were asking, the sorts of things we were probing would have been different, because we wouldn't have had the insight into what other members of the research team had found and were thinking. Okay, let's move on to Brennen Chapter 3, and this is the fourth slide in the interview PowerPoint. I'll skip over the definition. I think we know that, a purposeful conversation between two or more people. there is an important and interesting point that interviewing has a deep history in Western society. This isn't something that has just sort of emerged with greater focus on social science and, understanding collectives toward the end of the middle and end of the 19th century. This is something that has deep, deep roots, as is discussed, and something to, think about. If you're interested in some of that history and, the origins of philosophy and stuff, you can go back and look at that. Interviews can broaden our knowledge base and help us understand alternative points of view. So there is a lot of potential to be gained for us as researchers, but also for the interviewee. If it's a positive process, it's a topic they're interested in, they're likely to gain something as well. And I've had the experience, a number of times of interviewees at the end saying, wow, this was really stimulating. I'm really glad we did this. It made me think about this topic in some different ways. And that's good. That's providing something positive for the time and energy that these interviewees are dedicating. So 3 types of interviews that Brennen identifies here: structured, following a standardized procedure, questions in a specific order. This is more used in surveys where you don't vary the question order at all. Everybody gets the exact same question, and then you're able to run statistical analyses on the results. More common in qualitative research is semi-structured and unstructured. The semi-structured giving the researcher that flexibility to be able to change question order, as I mentioned before, to ask follow-up questions, to ask clarifications, so not being completely wedded to that standardized procedure or question list. And then unstructured, which can usually can begin with sort of some general topics, and then are often open-ended questions, and the idea being that the conversation develops organically. So more like starting with prompts and then moving on from there, rather than having even a flexible list of questions. And oftentimes that's used in sort of the preliminary phases of a study, just to see what people are thinking about a particular topic, and to gain some insight into whatever it is that the researcher is wanting to study. Moving on to slide 5, qualitative interviewing, heavily influenced by constructivist theoretical orientation. It strives to understand the context, meanings, opinions, and interests mentioned by the interviewees. So that's just kind of a general characterization. Keep in mind that the last 2 supplementary readings, H and I, look at constructivism and structuralism and critique it. So that this notion is something that we're going to be talking about in class, and that is really engaged in those 2 supplementary readings. Digital Turn has encouraged more virtual interviewing, obviously through modes like what we're using right now, being able to use video conferencing, or in this case, recording for later viewing. So video conferencing can capture some of the nonverbal communication, but in a mediated fashion, right? Text-based interviewing can mask some of the nuance, sarcasm, etc., and often encourages briefer responses. So like right now, watching this video, you are able to pick up on some nuances through my nonverbal communication, my hand here, etc. Trying to make eye contact with y'all. But if it was just text-based, it would be quite different. In other words, if I had sort of narrated this and then, transcribed it and then sent this to you as a text to read, that would be quite different. As I mentioned before, listening is super important. Listening is central to all qualitative interviewing. Interviewers must remain open and flexible throughout. And then there are a couple of interesting concepts here that are mentioned. Stud Terkel's feeling tone that can emerge from interviewing, and the importance of capturing that and making it part of the analysis, and also Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist's notion of thick description, of going into the field, making observations, and then providing thick descriptions of what you see. A lot of that was through participant observation on his part, or just observation, but that can also come out of interviewing, and is important again to take those notes and sort of record one's impressions and try to get as much information as possible about the interview and how it unfolded, the orientation of the interviewee, that kind of thing. Moving on to slide 6. Ethics are certainly at play here. That's one of the reasons that we have IRB, but keep in mind that there are a lot of ethical questions that can come up along the way that the researcher, the interviewer, needs to be ready to address and think through and act on. There are often power imbalances between respondents and interviewers. That's certainly the case when we go into the field in West Texas to speak with a lot of the folks that we do for the work through the Harris Institute, coming from an academic setting, having multiple graduate degrees, an academic lifestyle versus what are mostly, not exclusively, but mostly blue collar people, many of them, working on ranches or in, industries like construction, trucking, oil field, et cetera. So that needs to be taken into account and accounted for. Integrity, honesty, and fairness are always the first consideration. Lean on the side of doing what's right or what's ethical if a question comes up, and unless it is part of the research design and you've gotten permission through IRB to use deception, don't use it. It really has no place in interviewing in the field like this. In terms of study design, there's this notion of topic saturation. This is sort of how many interviews do you conduct? When do you know that you've done enough in terms of that N? And basically, when you're not really uncovering any new material and new themes from interviewees, that's when you can stop. And I don't think the term is used in the chapter, but we talk about that as saturation. Trust, as mentioned before, is critical, and often that developing trust involves empathy. That is the ability of the researcher to be able to see the world through somebody else's eyes, not entirely, but enough to be able to establish that important connection. And then what can really help in that regard is familiarity with the respondent's language, customs, and culture, and that can help overcome some other differences like ethnicity, race, gender, etc. So in my own case, I've talked about this in class. Knowing enough about Latino culture, or Mexican American culture more specifically, and the Spanish language has helped me bridge some of the divides that might occur in terms of my being an Anglo-American, my being older than many of my interviewees, being able to speak Spanish well enough to conduct interviews in Spanish is important in that regard. And I'm not saying go out and learn a whole new language, just to do that, but there are a lot of ways to gain familiarity that can take you quite a ways in developing empathy, as we've talked about before in class. Background knowledge of the industry and the organization being studied is essential, and that's where those trade journals can come in, where talking to people can come in, following the news in a particular area. And we've got all kinds of resources available now with the internet. I sound like a dinosaur saying that, but keep in mind that there is a lot of information available if you take the time to go and find it. And, keep in mind interlibrary loan and being able to use sort of allies to help you identify and inform you. The interviews location and setting may influence the power dynamic and content quality. We've talked about that in terms of, for example, bringing people to campus into some kind of sterile, research room versus being in their setting in their homes and that kind of thing, or maybe a favorite restaurant. We've conducted quite a few interviews in rooms off of the sort of common area in a church, the fellowship hall, and that's a place where people feel comfortable and they're in a setting that they know it's different, more likely to put them at ease. Moving on to slide 7 here, icebreaker questions can be double-edged. So, put the interviewer at ease, that you're prepared to be, or they can be too creepy or intrusive. So there's some discussion in Brennen chapter 3 about doing some background, work into finding out more about your interviewee. Keep that rather general. I wouldn't go into, too much detail or make it sound like you've spent a lot of time online seeing who they are and trying to find out about them, because that can make people feel uncomfortable. And then there's this example of the jockey Eddie Arcaro on page 42 that I think is a good example of how the interviewer was able to get some very important information that gave him confidence that they knew what they were doing, and then he was able to and willing to open up more and talk about his life as a jockey because of that background knowledge the interviewer had. Use simple, direct, open-ended questions that encourage interviewees to elaborate on their feelings, opinions, and experiences. And I have on there garbage in, garbage out. That's a term from the early days of the internet. Basically, don't expect quality answers from poor questions. You have to really ask good questions that are on topic and eliciting exactly what you want to know from the interviewee. Otherwise, you're going to get probably vague or off-topic responses. So that's why developing those questions, practicing them in advance is really important. Only raise sensitive questions if and when trust and rapport have been established. So you don't want to do them too early in the interview or too late where it looks like you're slapping them on, like, oh gosh, I got to know this before we finish up here. So probably in the middle of the interview is a good place, but avoid asking them if there's some tension or you don't feel like the interviewee is entirely comfortable. A neutral stance on issues and non-threatening language is important. Keep in mind posture, nonverbal cues, and this is why practicing in advance is highly recommended. And you might even ask your interviewees for this homework assignment I've given you afterwards, after the interview is done. Was there anything about my comportment, about the way I asked the questions or the way I was communicating nonverbally while you were answering that you thought was a little bit odd or maybe made you feel uncomfortable? And hopefully they'll say no, but if they say yes and give you an example, then it's something to work on. And there's always mirrors to practice in front of. 4 types of responses by interviewers, and this is coming from Berger, 1998. Understanding types of responses are used for clarification, where the interviewer would say something like, "Did I understand correctly?" or "Could you clarify your point about?" Probing questions are used to delve more deeply into a comment, opinion, position on the issue, etc. And you might think about what those are in advance. Maybe have some examples of probing questions that are likely to come up if an interviewee responds to a question in a particular way. Evaluative is where the interviewer states an opinion. Avoid these unless you absolutely have to use them, because you don't want to become the focus of the conversation. This is about them and about the information that you can get from them and how it's helping, your research, not about you. And then emphatic signal that the interview understands and encourages more information, like, yes, I understand. That's interesting. Please tell me more. You've seen these in other contexts, like trying, to maybe mediate between a couple parties that aren't getting along or something, just sort of repeating to make sure that you understand, and that the interviewee is in agreement with your assessment. So keep those in mind. Moving on to slide 9. It is a qualitative interviews challenge to motivate and draw out the best stories from each interviewee, and that's kind of a goal you're working toward. Don't think that you're going to be able to do that, the first couple of interviews that you conduct, but that's sort of the goal, is to be able to mold the interview into an exchange where you're able to get those focused, sort of heartfelt, meaningful stories from your interviewee. And then transcribing interviews, try to do it while the interviews are fresh in your mind. And this can help to resolve any misunderstandings or problems that might come up, like, what was going on there? I don't understand exactly what the transcript is saying there. If it's fresher in your mind, you're more likely to be able to resolve that effectively. Automated speech recognition tools like Otter AI, HappyScribe, Dragon, and Trent are available. Transcriptions must be reviewed and corrected as needed. I did suggest in the assignment that I gave you for the 2 interviews that if you come across a software that is available for free on a site or has a very low charge for students, please post that in the general discussion forum. I looked on the university's list of available software and I didn't see any of these, but I know students have used Otter quite inexpensively. So, please do post that information for others to be able to use as you're completing that assignment. Conduct only light editing on transcriptions to avoid altering the essence. Some people say don't edit at all, but having just said I don't like having a lot of that, those pause fillers in there. They just kind of clutter up the transcript as far as I'm concerned and don't need to be included. You may put in your notes, this person used a lot of those pause fillers or a lot of delay in responding to questions. I had an interviewee for the project with Professor McLaughlin, who was like that. He's a school teacher, and he would really think through the questions, and he would even sometimes stop mid-sentence to really think through what he wanted to complete. And I wrote that as part of the field notes, and I still remember it, these years later, probably 7, 8 years later, because it was a characteristic of that interview, which was very revealing, but I had to be patient with him needing the time in order to think through what he wanted to say, how he was going to complete his response to a particular question. In terms of analysis, slide 10 begins with notes about the interview, taking shortly after it's completed. I've talked about that. There is qualitative data analysis software that can help you identify patterns and connections with the data, and that includes NVivo, Atlas TI, Max QDA. And these may be available through the university IT that's located there in the basement of, not IT in terms of fixing your computer or whatever, but maybe it's AT, academic technology, in the basement of the university library. So again, if somebody finds out more information on that, please post it. The constant comparative process is used to identify patterns and categories in the data to help the researcher develop grounded theory in the data itself. We talked about grounded theory earlier in the course that sort of evolves from the data, and it makes sense that you need the data in order to develop that grounded theory. And the constant comparative process is one of the main ones used by qualitative researchers in order to do that, to accomplish that. Do try to verify information from other sources and interviewees through triangulation, which we've talked about a little bit, and we're going to be talking about more in the weeks to come. So now we're transitioning over to Lindlof and Taylor, Chapter 7, on qualitative interviewing. And here the text is broken up a little bit because in the middle there's some discussion of focus groups, which actually we're going to be talking about the next 2 weeks. But obviously some of this information was repetitive from the Brennen chapter, so that I tried to, just leave it as is and then just focus on what's new or maybe a little bit different from Lindlof and Taylor's approach. So this is slide 11. What kinds of interviews have you done before? That's a question I'll ask in class on Thursday, but think about that. Like, as an interviewee, what sorts of questions have you been asked? What have people wanted to know about you as a student, maybe as a specialist, your interests in gaming, music, whatever it might be, weather, and also certainly as a consumer, as somebody who uses media and consumes products. Interviews, they mention or identify as conversations with a purpose or talk that is typically furnished for someone else's benefit, and as much an art as a science. So there are some challenges that they identify, and I've mentioned these prior. People aren't always truthful, reliable sources of witness information. They may exaggerate, repress, lie, withhold facts. That's why it's important to be attentive and also to have done some background research and to look and see how a particular interviewees or maybe a group of interviewees' responses differ from others. Interviewees are inherently biased in favor of their own values and interests. This is human nature. We like to present ourselves as good, upstanding human beings to others, not as, sort of immoral jerks. And that needs to be accounted for as well. Academic communicative codes and conventions influence research interviews. These are, I guess, cultural contextual differences often between interviewers and interviewees. I referred to this a little bit earlier. Also, do be sensitive to contextual factors that might be influencing an interview, where it's being conducted, who else is around, how you had gotten in touch with this person, some of the sensitivities regarding the topic that you're discussing, like, COVID-19. There were people who just outright refused to talk to us about their experiences with COVID-19 because they thought it would be too painful. They just didn't want to go there. They were, done with COVID, as it were, or thought there might be some kind of a political agenda behind the work that we were doing. And, it is politicized. In fact, there's going to be an event on Thursday that is over at the ICC that's calling into question the leadership of the health institutions, the United States during COVID, basically saying that people like Fauci and Nix and others were, negligent in calling for lockdowns and 6 foot, distance and masking and all that. So, here in 2025, 5 years later, after the lockdowns, we're still sort of litigating whether the responses were scientific or if it was government overreach or whatever it might be. So we need to be understanding the sensitivities surrounding the topics that we are interviewing people about. Lindlof and Taylor identify 3 different types of interview talk. Storytelling, I think we're all familiar with as people who study media. Interviewees tell stories according to their own understandings, but usually with less contradiction and unpredictability than their lives actually encompass. So these stories get cleaned up quite a bit. Not always. We heard some pretty heart-wrenching details about, for example, differences of opinion and sort of power dynamics in families regarding whether to get vaccinated or not, or whether to follow the protocols that I just mentioned of masking, social distancing, et cetera. And in those cases, those stories we didn't feel were cleaned up, but I'm sure we heard others that people didn't get into some of the, more negative details or, nuances of their experiences. That's, again, human nature. Accounts, excuses, or justifications for social conduct for various reasons. So, keep in mind, in order to sort of preserve that positive self-image, these kinds of things can happen. But, we do often get into this sort of area of trying to get people's accounts of certain situations, experiences, developments, and then explanations, which can provide insight into unwritten or unspoken processes, beliefs, etc. So if you ask a question of, we'll explain why that happened, or, how it is that you had that response to that situation, it can lead to these explanations. So different uses of interviews: elicit language forms that are used by particularly members of a culture, interest group, etc. Inquire into the past of a person or community. Verify, validate, or comment on information that's obtained from other sources. Again, that's the basic process of triangulation, and achieve efficiency in data collection. Different types of interviews that Lindlof and Taylor identify, and this is slide 13. Ethnographic are spontaneous, not very highly structured, often occurring in a cultural scene where the interviewer has already gained access. So you're not going to whip out the clipboard and start with a pen in that situation. Informant, people with knowledge, unofficial or official, about a particular scene, share it with the researcher. And keep in mind that this can apply to industry and organizations, as a number of you are interested in, not just sort of cultural groupings of people. The respondent interviews, people describe or interpret the meaning or dimensions of their lived experience. And then narrative, when the act of storytelling is as important as the story content. So you're not just interested in what they have to say, but how and why they might say it. Narrative is retrospective meaning making, the shaping and ordering of past experience, and that can be quite telling, right? Moving on to slide 14. Elements that can improve interview quality. Some of this is just basic common sense, but let's go over them quickly. Framing the interview as an egalitarian project. So this isn't just about, me finishing my thesis or dissertation or getting enough publications for, tenure or whatever, that, this can really help society, or maybe this group more broadly. Yielding some control to the interviewee, allowing them some agency, can really make them feel more empowered and likely open up more on some of the topics you're discussing. Using a relatively quiet, protected place where comfort and confidentiality are protected. So you want to balance between it being, too quiet and sterile, or being too ruckus. I conducted one interview, started it at a fair at a town here on the South Plains, and the Tejano band started up halfway through it, and these people were sitting in the front row. It was just unfortunate timing, and was barely able to transcribe the rest of the interview because even with getting some help from Dr. Stone and others in terms of dealing with the audio levels and trying to bring up what the respondent was saying and I was saying, and down the music, it was very, very difficult. So be careful about that. Mediated context, try to project respect, warmth, and empathy. We've talked about that. Avoid asynchronicity, that is asking, a question like through email or on social media or something, and then them responding at a different time. It's just doesn't allow, as we've talked about before, cues and follow-up and reading cues, follow-up, that kind of thing. Have protocols in place to protect privacy and data security. You're required to do that for IRB. Make sure you follow those protocols once they are approved. Downplay but don't dismiss the presence of recording devices. You don't want to act like they're not there, but you also, as the book says, don't want to be focusing on it too much or keep looking over at it. I strongly encourage using two devices. So usually I'll check out a recorder from the third floor there, use that, but then also have my phone going just in case one of them fails. You don't lose the interview entirely. That's a real bummer when that happens. Establish rapport quickly and effectively. In this sense, self-disclosures can be effective, but don't go too far, right? Maybe talk a little bit about how you're related to the topic, or how this topic became of interest to you, and what value you see in getting information from people like the interviewee. And it's good to practice these in advance, so you can kind of have a script in your head that can just come out and is effective. And try it out with other people, with your peers, to see how well you think you're engaging and making that effort to establish rapport. As I've mentioned a couple times, active listening is very important. So is mindful questioning. So if you're listening careful and you're thinking about their responses in the context of your interview questions, you should be able to change the order, or change maybe some of the wording in a question to be more effective, and working off of that interview guide. Moving on to 15. Interview guides are more, in terms of question design and use, interview guides are more informal and flexible than interview schedules. So this is a difference between the more structured and the semi-structured types of approaches. Questions should be sequenced logically to maintain flow in the interview. Difficult or sensitive questions are best placed in the middle. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Practice interviews in advance for accurate time estimate and to adjust your own pace. So you don't want to be talking so fast that they can't really understand you, but also if you go too slow, they might get really tired and bored. So you need to really, get that pace right, and you can do that by practicing and record yourself. It can be really uncomfortable, but it's better to sort of get past some of that discomfort and make sure you're doing it well before going into the field rather than later. I have a student in the field right now, and I insisted that she practice several times before going out and implementing the interview, and I think it helped because she got over some of that self-consciousness of her own voice and conducting the interview. You want to get that out of the way through, the practice interviews that don't count aren't included as part of the data rather than when you're actually out in the field. Non-directive questions are open-ended, encouraging detailed responses, allowing the respondent to guide the conversation, as opposed to leading questions that seek specific answers, yes, no, or, just basically replying to the question but without elaborating at all. So some different types of questions. Non-directive questions or tour questions prompt the interviewees to walk one through a part of their life. You're not actually physically walking with them, but take me through that process, or how you got into this industry, or how you dealt with that particular challenge. Timeline questions gather stories or issues about a person or an entity within a discrete period of time. So there's a beginning, there's an end, and you're asking them for that sort of sequence of events, the story in between those bookends. Example or experience questions ask for specific instances as illustrative exemplars, and you may want to be ready to ask an experience or example question as a follow-up to one of the questions that you have. If it's a little bit vague, or if it's like super interesting and you want more detail, be ready to do that. Continuing with non-directive questions on the next slide. Why questions provide insight into motivations, justifications, speculations. I think we all know that. We've been asked a lot as students, right, by professors. Well, why? Posing the ideal. Interview uses a hypothetical scenario to probe into the interviewee's beliefs, ideological positions, etc. Native language question. and this is not like natural language, this is more within a specific cultural grouping, to learn the symbolic significance of particular linguistic terms, who uses them and in what contexts. I think we know that a lot of different groups in society have their own specific sort of vocabulary and means of communicating, and these native language questions can help us get at those. Now moving on to directive questions, which are more closed-ended, that require a specific concise answer like yes, no, piece of information rather than encouraging a detailed response or open discussion. Structural questions probe how the interviewee organizes knowledge, and that might be asked, through a dichotomy or along a continuum or in opposition, so that you set it up, two opposites and ask the interviewee to maybe select one or describe the relationship between them or something like that. Emergent idea question elicits the interviewee evaluation of an idea, a hypothetical proposal, or something similar. The devil's advocate, I think we all know what these are, challenges an interviewee's beliefs or commonly held points of view. Again, make sure that you've got adequate rapport with the interviewee before asking one of these, or you might say, now I'm going to ask a sort of devil's advocate or challenging question. It's not that I don't, believe what you said before, but this is a way for me to understand, another aspect of what we're talking about here. And elicitation, verbal and or visual stimuli used to engender responses. So these might be, pictures, videos, memes, short text, whatever it is, and then you're asking them to engage that and then respond to it. Still remember after all these years, a very interesting news report where they were going into some of these outlying areas in Afghanistan and showing pictures of the 9/11 attacks just to see what people knew, like, this is an important trigger for U.S. intervention into Afghanistan and, our eventual 20-year presence there. And like 90% of the people they talked to had no idea what, a picture of, one of the planes flying into one of the Twin Towers or, the towers falling or other sort of iconic images related to 9/11 were about. So that's an example in news reporting of elicitation. Probe, brief remark, work, gesture, or other type of expression designed to generate greater clarity or detail. As I mentioned before, in terms of follow-ups, have these probes available at the ready in order to dig deeper when an interviewee says something that might be particularly interesting or insightful, or maybe unexpected, and to get at why they said that, why they feel that way when it's so different from your expectation. And then loose ends questions are ones that arise during the interview that the researcher saves for the end, and you should have a way of being able to mark these, and find them at the end, or trigger them. Respondents should have the opportunity to ask questions or bring up related topics. These can often be revealing. So Lindlof and Taylor talk about that. These concluding segments can really be revealing. So don't just have this big sigh of relief like it's almost over, but really tune into what the interviewee, the respondent, is saying, because they're often quite revealing moments. So that ends the slides, again, for interviewing, just focused on the Brennen chapter and Lindlof and Taylor chapter. So I'm gonna end it here, and again ask you to prepare responses, or at least think carefully about the questions and topics on the 3 concluding slides to this PowerPoint. For supplementary readings G, H, and I, we'll talk about those at the beginning of class on the 27th. Thank you for your kind attention here, and also for your flexibility with us having to cancel class that day. I'm hoping that this video and having prepared some detailed slides like this will help us move along, transitioning from interviewing into focus groups. I will look forward to seeing you soon in the classroom. And don't forget about that assignment and conducting those interviews based on this information, or at least taking into account this information that we've just covered. See you soon. Thanks. Bye.